Appalachia has always been home to some of the most colorful characters in history. Rugged men of honor who feared neither man nor beast. Join us as we count down the top 10 mountain men to ever call Appalachia home. Welcome to the top 10 mountain men from Appalachia. Hey everyone, JD Phillips here, and I'm glad you're here as well. The famous bear hunter, James Whitehead, hailed from the mountains of Carter County, Tennessee. And during his lifetime, James earned the nickname Tiger, and for good reason too. Kicking off our countdown, coming in at number 10, is the incredible, true story of James Tiger Whitehead.
My name is Tiger Whitehead, and I was born in the wilderness of Carter County, Tennessee in 1819. I was the first generation of my family born in this remote region. There were no roads in or out of this section. Instead, my pa had first arrived here by traveling over the Great Iron Mountain, by following a creek up the North Carolina side and then down the Tennessee side before settling in a small valley nestled in the shadow of Roan Mountain. When he first laid eyes on it, he said it reminded him of the Garden of Eden. So it was here we settled next to a crystal clear stream. Wild game was abundant. No white men had ever hunted this section before. Every wild beast imaginable roamed free, just as they had for thousands of years. Now Paul, he was a true pioneer in every sense of the word. The only thing he feared was the Lord. He spent his days teaching me how to hunt, how to track animals, and how to train a good hunting dog. For us, our dogs were just like family members. We depended on them as much as we did our old hog-killing rifle. You see, hunting was in our blood. It was our only means of survival as we roamed the virgin forest, dominated by massive chestnut trees and awe-inspiring waterfalls. Our bear hunts would last for weeks at a time. We barely had any neighbors, and we didn't even know what money was. But for us, it was truly heaven on earth. So it was. I spent my entire youth surrounded by an endless forest, and I learned my hunting skills in the same manner as Daniel Boone did before me. And by the time I was a teen, I had already began to make a name for myself as an expert hunter. Even amongst the old-timers, I began to push deeper and deeper into the remote areas in search of the most elusive bears. Heck, I had already killed nearly 20 bears on my own before I was 18 years old. It was on one of these hunting trips into an area that the old-timers called No Man's Land that I came across an animal that I'd never seen before, one that was thought not to exist at all. It had the most exotic fur I'd ever seen. At first, I thought it was some sort of panther, since these mountains were full of them. But no, this was something completely different. It moved with a stealth, cat-like quickness and the power of an angry mama bear. I had tracked the animal for a solid 3 days, only getting glimpses of it as it laid on some distant rock bridge, or just as it disappeared over the hillside. It was unlike any animal I'd ever tracked before. And on the morning of the 4th day, just before the sun rose, I heard a strange growl. And then my best dog, Coy, started whining like I had never heard before. An eerie feeling set in. I had a strong feeling that we were being watched, and it turns out the animal was actually tracking us, waiting for the perfect moment to ambush us. Last night's fire was gone, and our camp was in complete darkness, when suddenly, all hell broke loose. as the beast lunged from the trees and attacked Coy with savage paws. He ripped mightily into the dog's torso. And each time, Coy would let out a violent cry. It was dark, so dark, I couldn't get a clear shot, and I couldn't take a chance on accidentally shooting my faithful dog. I had no choice. This animal was going to kill him if I didn't do something quick. I opened my knife, and I charged towards the beast. With a powerful thrust, I stabbed the creature in his stomach. But the blow wasn't lethal, and the animal turned towards me with rage in his eyes. I tried to make a run for it, but within 3 steps, the predator had caught me and bit into my leg. Frantically, I swung my blade over and over, stabbing at the beast. Just then, Coy, who was badly wounded, rejoined the fight. Diverting the wild animal away from me, the beast pinned Coy to the ground, and I knew he was about to go for his neck. There was no time to think. I just dove on the animal's back and sank my blade deep into his throat. A savage roar sounded as the animal staggered for a few moments before falling to the ground. It had been a hell of a battle of hand-to-hand combat, and I spent the morning tending to Coy's wounds and wrapping my leg to stop the bleeding. Once the sun peeped over the ridge, I began to examine the unknown beast. It was golden, with black stripes and massive teeth. I had no idea what it was, but its fur was sure to fetch a lot of attention at the trading post down in the valley. A few weeks later, Coy and I had healed up pretty good, and we took the animal hide down to Bristol, where it became the talk of the town. Turns out, the animal was a tiger that had escaped from a traveling circus over in North Carolina. It had been roaming the mountains for nearly 2 years, killing families' milk cows and chickens, when I killed it with my bare hands and a hunting knife. From that day on, everyone called me Tiger, and the name stuck, and I proudly carried it with me for the rest of my life. Now, ain't that something? Can you imagine fighting a tiger with only a knife? Well, Tiger Whitehead ended up marrying a woman named Sally Garland, and they built a cabin and a grist mill on the same creek that Tiger's father had followed years ago across the mountains from North Carolina into Tennessee. Tiger's legend continued to grow as his bear total passed 40, then 50, and then 60. On one hunt, his faithful dog Coy treed a bear, and Tiger fired his last bullet from his trusty muzzle loader. But all it did was make the bear mad, who proceeded to drop out of the tree and cornered Tiger on a rock ledge. Without even thinking, Tiger thrust the barrel of his weapon into the open mouth of the bear and began stabbing it with his knife until the animal gave up the attack. Newspapers across America began to hail him as the greatest bear hunter in American history. With all these wagging tongues, soon there was hunters from outside of Appalachia who began making hunting trips to Tiger's hunting grounds. While Tiger himself spent his life only killing animals to feed his family, these new hunters were simply killing for the thrill. Many times they would orphan bear cubs. Once, when Sally was nursing her own child, Tiger brought 2 orphan bear cubs that he found in the woods, and Sally nursed them until they were able to fend for themselves. Another time, she did the same thing for an orphan fawn. To say the least, she was quite a woman. An old Tiger spent his entire life in these mountains of Carter County, and as he entered the twilight years of his 80s, he had killed 99 bears during his lifetime. Yet, by now, his eyesight had grew dim, and his health was quickly failing him. At the same time, all of Tiger's friends wanted him to have the record for 100 bears before he met his maker. So much so that as old Tiger was laying on his deathbed, his 2 best friends brought in a bear cub to his bedside for their friend to reach 100. Yet, Tiger refused, saying he would never kill a captured animal, and he would only do it to feed his family. And with that, Tiger Whitehead, the greatest bear hunter in Appalachia, passed on. Today, most folks have never heard of him, and his story has been nearly forgotten. But if you ever find yourself riding the back roads and you stumble upon Tiger Creek Road next to Tiger Creek that runs through Tiger Valley, pull over to the side of the road and head up to Tiger Whitehead Cemetery, where the first tombstone you will see reads, "Here lays the noted hunter James T. Whitehead, born 1819 and died 1905, killed 99 bears. We hope he has gone to rest." And right beside him, you'll see Sally's stone, which reads, "Here lays Sally Garland, not only a mother to the human race, but to all animal kind, as she gave nurse to one fawn and 2 cubs from her breast." I like to think that old Coy is laying nearby too. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. Let me know what you think in the comments below.
Don't go anywhere, folks. There's plenty of true stories of legendary mountain men coming right up, and you don't want to miss this next story. Next, we travel to the summit of the mighty Iron Mountains, where Tennessee and North Carolina meet. It's here that we find a man named Uncle Nick Grindstaff. This is perhaps one of the most powerful stories ever told. Coming in at number 9, the true story of Nick Grindstaff.
I was born on December 26, 1851, in the middle of a snowstorm in Johnson County, Tennessee. I was the youngest of 3 boys, and I had an older sister. They say my ma and pa were good people, but I can't really say. You see, they both died of the fever in the middle of the winter when I was just 3 years old. I don't have a single memory of either of them. My brothers and sisters told me it was better that way, since memories just made it more painful. So there we were, orphans in rural Appalachia, taken in by some relatives who took care of us until we were of age. We lived on our parents' land, about 50 acres, on the side of a mountain overlooking a small valley town. To me, even though I had my brothers and sisters, I always felt alone. I would look out there and wonder what life was like beyond that valley. I loved to read books about the great prairies out west. It seemed like freedom to me, free from the poverty and isolation of these mountains. And one day, I was going to get the courage to climb down this mountain and head out into the great unknown and make my own way in life to seek my own fortune. In many ways, my older sister Marie was like my mother. She had raised me, and she saw fit that I attended the one-room schoolhouse about 2 miles down the mountain. She fed me and made my clothes. She would often travel down to the valley to trade roots that she had dug for books that I could read. She loved me like I was her own child. My brothers struck out on their own as soon as they were old enough to take care of themselves, and before long, my sister married. It seemed like all of them wanted to start their own families, to try to recreate something that none of us had ever had. In the winter of 1872, we all met for the final time to sell Ma and Pa's land. All of my siblings were married with their own children, and they had all moved down the mountain. And none of us really even had any connection to our parents' land. It seemed just like a cruel reminder of our lonely childhood. And we sold the land and we split the money. And even though none of us spoke the words out loud, we knew this would be our last time that we were all together. And as fate would have it, it was. I took my share of the money and I moved down the mountain, buying a patch of land to farm for the next few years. It seemed like I was doing what everyone said I should do. Heck, this is what all mountain folks did. Work the ground for your food and barely exist. But deep inside me, my heart still longed to get as far away from these mountains as I could. There was no one here for me, and even when I was in the company of other people, I felt completely alone. There comes a time in a man's life when he has to make a choice to forget about silly childhood dreams or follow his heart. So, in the spring of 1877, I sold my land and what little possessions I owned, and I set out on my horse westward. I needed to know what was out there. I had to find a place where I belonged. I traveled over the great river that the natives called the Mississippi, through the Ozark Mountains, and across the Great Plains. I had never seen such beautiful sunsets or violent storms. I never stayed in a place for more than a night to rest, and in the summer of 1878, I traveled over the Rocky Mountains before finally settling down in the California Valley. At first, I thought I would find a spot to dig for gold, but the famous gold rush of the 1850s was winding down, and most men were going broke looking for what little remained. I had always had a way with animals. Even back in Appalachia, I could walk right up next to a deer. They weren't afraid of me. So I tried my hand at herding sheep, and those animals trusted me in the same way. I was really good at it, and soon I was making a name for myself as one of the best sheep herders there was. At my peak, I had over 5,000 sheep, and I was making good money for the first time in my life. I met a beautiful woman named Doreen, who had also been an orphan as a child, and we had an instant bond with each other, something much deeper than fleshly desires. She understood what was inside of me in a way no other human could. I loved Doreen like I never realized I could love anything. And soon we were married, and we dreamed of raising a family together. It all seemed too good to be true. I had a beautiful wife. I was wealthy, with a large patch of land and a 3-room cabin. Yet, life has a way of kicking a man in the gut when he least expects it. All of my happiness was ripped out of my soul when Doreen took sick with a fever, just like my parents had years before. And Doreen died. I have to say, a part of me died in that cabin with her.
Minutes turn to days, and colors turn to gray without you. Memories start to fade, and everything is pale without you. And I can feel the love. My mind runs free above whenever you're with me.
I sold everything I had, and I decided to return home to Appalachia. I spent the next 4 months traveling across America, and one night I stopped for a drink in a saloon in some small town in Missouri when a beautiful woman tricked me into going into the back room of the saloon where her partner in crime was hiding. They robbed me of all my money after hitting me in the head with a pistol, and when I came to, I was laying on the ground in front of the saloon, and they had even taken my horse. I would have to walk the rest of the way back to the mountains of East Tennessee. And so it was. In the spring of 1883, I arrived home with only the clothes on my back. My sister had died while I was gone, and both of my brothers blamed me. They said she died of a broken heart because I left. I found myself staring at the sky, yet I wasn't looking for answers anymore. I now knew my purpose. The only connection I'd ever had in this world was to the mountains and the animals that lived there. I climbed to the top of the Iron Mountains in the Cherokee National Forest, and there I would spend the remainder of my life in solitude. I built an 8-by-8-foot cabin with no windows, only a small door, and fashioned a chimney out of rocks and mud. The only furniture I had was a bed that I made out of a split log to lay on the floor. I spent most of my days clearing the land, hunting, or working my garden. Twice a year, I would come down off the mountain to trade roots and ginseng for supplies at the general store in the valley. Occasionally, a drifter would stumble across my cabin, since the Appalachian Trail was nearby. But other than that, the animals were my only friends. I had a milk cow named Mary, an ox, and a faithful dog named Panther. One night, I woke up to find a rattlesnake coiled up near my fireplace, but I left him alone. And he soon made my cabin his home, living there for several years, until a visitor shot and killed him when he first saw him. I can't tell you how angry that made me. That snake had never done anything to me. And I'd met many people in my life that were a lot meaner than any rattlesnake. I came to accept that I was as much part of the mountains as the animals in the creeks. This is where I belonged. I wasn't afraid of the wilderness because I was the wilderness itself.
Nick Grindstaff remained isolated in the mountains of the Cherokee National Forest for 40 years. Folks in Johnson County, Tennessee would look for him each spring and summer when he came down to buy supplies in the valley, and they began calling him Uncle Nick. However, in July of 1923, he never came down off the mountain, and the owner of the general store went to Nick's cabin to check on him. When he opened the door, he found that Nick had been dead for about 4 days. His dog Panther was still lying on Nick's chest, protecting his best friend. The store owner couldn't remove the body because Panther wouldn't leave his side and viciously attacked anyone who tried to touch Nick's body. The store owner returned the next day with several men, and they finally tied a rope to Panther and secured him to a tree so they could remove Nick from the cabin. More than 200 people climbed to the top of Iron Mountain for Nick's funeral. Panther laid in Nick's casket until they buried him next to his cabin. A few years later, Panther died and was buried next to his friend. Locals took the stone from Nick's chimney and made a tombstone for him that reads, Uncle Nick Grindstaff, born December 26, 1851, died July 22, 1923, lived alone, suffered alone, and died alone. Nick's grave is still located at the top of Iron Mountain, just off the Appalachian Trail. Coming up, one of my very own kinfolk makes the list of Appalachia's greatest mountain men, and you don't want to miss his incredible true story.
Give someone you love the gift of old-fashioned storytelling today. 2 volumes that'll make your heart smile. Click the link below or visit theappalachianstoryteller.com to order your copies today.
Felix Brazell, or as we called him, Uncle Bush, was such a character that they made a Hollywood movie about him called Get Low. It was a great movie, even if it was completely fiction. I couldn't let Uncle Bush go out like that, so I decided to tell his real story. Hailing from Roane County, Tennessee, a mountaineer with such an iconic face that I'm sure you'll recognize it. This is the true story of Uncle Bush.
most of his life, Felix Bruchalou Brazil had spent his days working the rocky soil of his hillside farm in Roane County, Tennessee. His homestead was nothing more than a one-room cabin with a lean-to shed and a smokehouse, all surrounded by a chestnut rail fence that he had built many years before. But for Felix Brazil, this was his kingdom, and sitting high atop the mountain ridge, it commanded one of the finest views of the valley below, where all those good-for-nothing flatlanders lived, nestled down there along the banks of the Emory River. Most folks down in the valley knew of the old man who lived alone at the top of Cave Creek Mountain as Uncle Bush. His felt slouch hat was always perched on top of his head, out of which flowed one of the most fantastic, burly gray mountain man beards ever seen this side of the Cumberland Gap. His face bore the hard lines and hinted of a hard life growing up in the aftermath of the war between the states. Yet, his eyes still had a curious spark in them that made it clear that he was a man who could read another person's worth just as quickly as he could predict the coming weather by the signs of the moon. Uncle Bush's disdain for strangers meant that he kept to himself. But he wasn't alone. No, not by a long shot. He spent every day with his best friend, who just so happened to be a 17-year-old mule, one that the mountain man had simply named Mule. But as Uncle Bush always said, "This mule here's got more common sense than pert near any person I've ever run across." Besides being the right smartest wild beast this side of Mabry's Mill, Uncle Bush had taught Mule all sorts of tricks that would boggle the mind of folks who witnessed them. "That's the smartest mule I've ever seen," many folks would say. The two were inseparable. From sunup to sundown each day, they worked the corn in the back-a patch, and they tilled the ground for the beans, the cabbage, and the taters. And each evening, they would make their way up to the orchard, up behind the cabin, where both Uncle Bush and the mule would watch the day slowly turn to dusk, while the two best friends picked apples from the trees. Mule would eat his right there on the spot, while the old man, well, he would just jar his up, let him sit a few months, and drink him later. From time to time, Uncle Bush's childhood sweetheart, Malvina Irwin, would drop in to sit a spell on the front porch with him. Although both of them were in their 70s, neither one of them had ever been married. Most folks said Malvina was still simply waiting on the old man to ask her, and the reason for her frequent visits was simply to see if he had made up his mind yet. But for his part, there were two things in life that Uncle Bush didn't have much faith in. The first one was preachers. Lord knows what foolishness will come out of one of those fellas' mouth once you give them a spot to preach and a crowd to listen to him, the old man chirped. And the second thing was marriage. Now, why in the world would I want to go and ruin a perfectly good relationship with a woman, one that I've loved all my life, by marrying her? Lord knows, I ain't never been one to take a liking to arguing and fussing all day, every day, and I ain't fixing to start now, Uncle Bush would say. And so it was, the mountain man and his mule lived isolated from the outside world, season after season, year after year, atop Cave Creek Mountain. He only came down twice a year with Mule loaded up with vegetables and fresh Mountain Dew that he would trade for a new pair of overalls or shotgun shells down at the local general store. One day, in the spring of 1938, the owner of the general store down in the valley made the long trek up to the Hermit's cabin, where he found the old man and mule sitting underneath the shade of a large black walnut tree. Uncle Bush was carving himself a new smoking pipe when he looked up and saw the familiar face. "Well, James Wilson, Lord have mercy, come on in and sit a while. What in tarnation brings a fella like yourself out this way?" "Well now, I'm afeard it's my duty to deliver some mighty bad news to you. And I've been fretting on exactly how I was going to break it to you the whole time I was traveling up here," the store owner said. Realizing the potential seriousness of the situation, the grizzled old recluse folded his pocket knife and put it in his pocket. "Well, I'm listening. Say your piece. I got news a few days ago that Miss Irvin, your Malvina, had taken powerful sick with a fever. The doc came and treated her with balsam oil and turpentine for a couple days, and it looked like she was going to pull through, but without any warning at all, she suddenly took a turn for the worse." James paused for a moment, and the heavy look on his face foretold how heavy the next words weighed on his mind. "Uncle Bush, I hate to be the one to tell you, but I knowed how you felt towards Malvina. But we lost her last night." There was a long silence, but it was obvious that the news had hit the old man hard, who gazed out towards the mountains in the distance. Death has a way of making everything in a man's world turn to a dull, numbing shade of gray, an aching pain so deep that there are no words that can begin to describe the ripping apart of a man's soul, exposing a vast black void that for the rest of time will never be whole again. "They'll be burying her down at Cave Creek Church tomorrow. Earl Lewis, the Methodist minister, is going to do the officiating," James said. The old man's eyes darted towards the store owner. At the very mention of a preacher, it was clear he didn't care too much for that preacher. "Now, Uncle Bush, I didn't come here aiming to start any trouble, and I understand your hard feelings towards the ministry after what they said about your pa when he passed years ago. But for the sake of Malvina, would you set all that aside and at least pay your respects at the funeral tomorrow?" The old man indeed remembered the words that were spoken at his father's funeral. You see, his pa wasn't the type of man to go to church much back then, and that old snake preacher used his father's funeral as an opportunity to ridicule those who didn't regularly go to the services. In Uncle Bush's mind, it seemed his pa's funeral was more an opportunity for that preacher to rustle up some customers for his church than it was to celebrate and commemorate his father's life. Uncle Bush finally spoke. "Me and Mule'll be there to pay our respects, but I ain't getting within earshot of that lying preacher. As soon as he's done, we'll say our goodbyes before they lay her in the ground." The next morning, it was a slow, drizzling rain, as Mule carried his old friend down the mountain to the little church in the valley. As they approached the cemetery, Uncle Bush rubbed the left side of Mule's neck, and, without a word being said, he stopped. There in the distance, the mountain man peered through the rain and watched the funeral service, just out of earshot of the preacher's words. And once the crowd dispersed, the drenched mountain man made his way to the wooden casket, where he reached into his coat and pulled out some flowers that she had planted near his cabin, and he placed them on the ground. With a tear in his eye, the old man whispered, "This ain't goodbye. Yes, I'll see you on the other side of the river." A couple months went by, and spring slowly gave way to summer. The store owner had made it a habit of going up and checking on the mountain man every few weeks. Today was no different as he hitched his horse at the gate. "Uncle Bush, you old rascal, you might as well build you one of those gazebo things as much time as you spend sitting under that old walnut tree. Hey, that reminds me. I've been meaning to ask you, what are you aiming to do with that old tree? I got a fella that does some trading down at my store, and he's been looking for some black walnut lumber. As big as that tree is, oh, you might fetch a mighty fine price." "Sorry, friend, the tree ain't for sale. I got plans for it." "Plans? What sort of plans?" "Well, since you asked, I'm going to build a coffin out of it." "A coffin? For who?" "For me." "Well, Uncle Bush, ain't nary a thing wrong with you. Why do you need a coffin?" "'Cause I got my mind set on having my own funeral in just a few weeks, while I'm alive, so I can hear exactly what they'll say about me when I'm gone." Now, I need to pause here for just a second. Now, I know what you're thinking. What? A funeral while you're alive? There ain't no such thing. Well, my friend, this is a true story that I'm telling you right now. And Uncle Bush wasn't kidding. That's right. He spent the next few weeks building himself a coffin and working out details of his funeral. At first, the funeral director in Kingston thought he had lost his mind. But after seeing that Uncle Bush was paying for the hearse and the grave digging, he agreed to take him on as a customer. Soon, wagging tongues had spread the story far and wide, and even a local reporter ran a story about the upcoming funeral in the Kingston Weekly newspaper. The Associated Press soon picked up on the story, and within a few days, it was published all across America. All of a sudden, this was shaping up to be the funeral of the century. Newspapers everywhere came to interview the living corpse. Uncle Bush would respond, "Oh, I know the time won't be long anyhow, 'cause last week a fox got after my chickens, and I missed the fox with my trusty hog-killing rifle. that my father used in the Civil War. And I was only 100 yards away, and right then, I knew something was wrong with me. A double quartet from the popular Chattanooga radio station volunteered to sing at the event. The famous Reverend C.E. Jackson, from all the way up in Illinois, agreed to officiate the event, complete with printed programs. Finally, on the morning of June 26, 1938, on his 74th birthday, a hearse arrived to pick up Felix Bushelo Brazel and take him to the cemetery of Cave Creek Baptist Church in Kingston, Tennessee. As they rumbled down the mountain, along a road that was barely more than a logging trail, Uncle Bush rode in the front seat of the hearse, with his homemade coffin in the back, and Mule in the front of the hearse, leading the procession to the graveyard. No one had ever seen anything like this. Every hotel was sold out for a week in advance. Every train, bus, and taxi was filled beyond capacity, as folks flocked in from all over America to witness the funeral. Locals began putting homemade signs on tractor trailers and farm equipment saying, $1 rides to Uncle Bush's funeral. Every road leading to the cemetery was backed up for over 7 miles each way, and all the fields along the road were turned into parking lots. The highway patrol was on site, directing traffic as best they could. Closer to the cemetery, the roads were completely jammed. Not even the hearse could get through the traffic, as photographers from all over the world snapped their flash bulbs at lightning speed, trying to get a glimpse of the dead man walking. The hearse couldn't get within 500 yards of the church due to the size of the crowd. So they stopped the car, and the pallbearers, which were local fox hunters and friends of the deceased man, carried the coffin as Uncle Bush and Mule followed behind. Cheers erupted from the 8,000 people in attendance as cops pushed through the crowd, forming a lane for the funeral party to pass through to the gravesite. All through the air echoed vendors selling everything from ice cold drinks, get your ice cold drinks, fresh sandwiches over here, get your sandwiches. The crowd was packed like sardines. Several people even fainted. Uncle Bush, dressed in the finest clothes he had purchased for the funeral, took a seat in front of his homemade black walnut casket, adorned with thousands of flowers. The Reverend C.E. Jackson stepped to the microphone. Folks, let's begin with silence, please. The huge sweating crowd stood silent, while pressing to the center, trying to get a glimpse of Uncle Bush as the tall sycamore trees in the rural church cemetery gently moved in a small breeze. Children were thrust high on their parents' shoulders. Soon, musicians from Knoxville, Chattanooga, and Kingston began singing the old gospel song, On Jordan's Stormy Banks I Stand. Then the preacher opened with the 23rd Psalms and then began his eulogy. Friends, I hope you people don't think this is an exhibition or an extravaganza, because it's not. It's way more serious than many of you people realize. The crowd grew quiet as Uncle Bush looked on. It's interesting to find an individual of this type, one who finds time to look into the future and consider his life. It might be a wholesome thing if everybody could hear his own funeral preached. Heck, it might do a lot of you'uns a heap of good to have to face the music of your life while you were still around to hear it. By God, it might improve your way of living. As the sermon went on, Uncle Bush had a sparkle in his eye, and even a slight smile escaped his lips as he heard the preacher heap praise on him and referred to him as an exemplary citizen. By all accounts, the funeral was a huge success. Uncle Bush declared it the finest funeral he had ever attended, and after the funeral, he spent several hours signing programs with his ex as cops tried to sort out the traffic nightmare. This will be my only funeral, Uncle Bush declared, and I'm mighty pleased with it. When I die, there won't be another. And it turns out he was a man of his word. You see, 5 years later, in 1943, Uncle Bush did in fact die. There was no singing, no preaching, and no funeral. They buried him right there in the spot where he'd had his funeral 5 years earlier, right beside his childhood sweetheart, Melvina. What about you, my friend? What do you think about having your own funeral while you were still around to hear what folks would say about you? Let me know in the comments below.
Stick around, y'all. There's plenty more to come, and we'll be right back. Coming in at number 7, one of the most faithful men to ever come out of Kentucky. This is the true story of Harrison Maize.
It all began 100 years ago when he painted a pig 'cause the good Lord told him so. Get right with God was what he'd had to say. This is the legend of Harrison Maize.
My name is Harrison Maize, and I was born just before the turn of the century in 1898. Our cabin was located on a place called Barren Creek, just below the Kentucky-Tennessee state line. Like most folks back then, Ma and Pa spent most days scratching at the flinty soil on their rocky hillside farm, growing just enough food to raise their 8 children. Seems everyone had large families back then. Heck, a man needed all the helping hands he could get. How else were the chores going to get done? Like milking the cow, collecting the chicken eggs, or the endless toting of water from the creek to the homestead. Not that us kids minded, though. It seemed like a privilege to help out our pa. He was a hard-working, God-fearing man. And what I remember the most about him is it seemed he always had a lot of worry written across his face and behind his eyes. Not that he ever said any of it out loud, but we all knew it was there. He spent many a night standing on the porch, studying the position of the moon or the shapes of the clouds. He always seemed to know exactly when it was going to rain, and he could predict a bad winter coming months in advance. In many ways, Pa was one of the last truly free men that were part of the wilderness itself. Just like his father and his grandfather before him, Pa had never worked a day in his life for money. He had never clocked in or out. Instead, he lived as one with both the forest and the wild beasts that inhabited it. Pa moved us all a few miles outside of Hillsboro, Kentucky, where he was hired on at the Fork Mountain Coal Camp, where they started him for $8.50 a week, but not in real money. Instead, they paid him with something called script that he could only spend at the company store. But they had all sorts of high-priced, store-bought things that made Ma's eyes sparkle at the mere sight of them. And for the first time in his life, Pa bought Ma a new dress, and all of us youngins got our first pair of shoes. Life had never been so good. Yet, somehow, after buying all these things, it turned out that Pa owed the company more money than he made. So back in the mine he went, day after day, for the rest of his life, literally trying to dig his way out of debt. For me, it seemed like we had moved to a great big city. The constant sounds of construction and the heavy equipment at the sawmills replaced the sounds of the forest. The chug of the steam engines on those iron horses echoed like thunder back and forth through the mountain valley as coal was loaded up at the tipple nonstop. Suddenly, time was important. They'd blow a whistle each morning when it was time for everybody to wake up. Then another one when it was time for the miners' shift to start. Then another one at lunch, and yet another at quitting time. Used to be, we ate food when our stomachs told us we were hungry. But now, we ate whether we were hungry or not when the whistle told us to. For the next several years, I spent most of my days attending the company school and helping Ma around the house. Most of my siblings were old enough to work in the mine with Pa. But me? No. I loved school. Bible study was my favorite part of the day. And our teacher, Miss Sally, would even let me take home a few sheets of scratch paper each day for me to practice writing Bible verses. I hoped I would grow up and become a preacher. I spent most nights after supper using small pieces of coal that Pa had brought home, drawing pictures with Bible verses underneath them to show Miss Sally the next morning. One day, on my 14th birthday, Miss Sally made cookies for me at school, and she gave me a big hug, and she told me she would miss me.
"Oh, Miss Sally, I ain't going nowhere,"
I replied. "But Harrison, don't you know? You're 14 now. A boy's schooling is done when he turns that age." The teacher replied.
"Well, what will I do now?"
I asked. "Well, you'll work in the coal mine, of course. You don't need no more schooling to work in the mine."
"But Miss Sally, all my life I've been aiming on becoming a preacher, not a miner."
The young teacher paused for a moment of reflection, and then she spoke. "Son, you don't have to be a preacher in a church to spread God's message. Just trust in the Lord, and He'll show you the way." And just like that, in that moment, my school days were over. And in many ways, so was my childhood. And I didn't know it at the time, but I would spend the rest of my life working in the darkness of a cold, damp coal mine. So there I was, just barely a teenager, but somehow a man at the same time, working 12 hours a day for the same coal company as my father. They called me a coupler boy. You see, electricity had come to the coal mine, and no longer did mules carry the coal carts out of the mine. Instead, there was a metal cable pulley system that pulled an endless train of coal carts, each full with over a ton of coal, up to the mouth of the mine. Each of these carts were coupled together with a pin that had to be removed at exactly the precise moment to separate the cart from the cable pulley system. The cart would continue down the tracks, and the pulley would roll up and back into the mine and start the process over again. Removing that pin at precisely the right moment was risky business, to say the least. Anything could go wrong, and many times it did. My friend Tommy and I, we saw many boys lose fingers, and even one boy lost an arm when he got caught between the carts. It seemed it wasn't a matter of if you would get hurt. The only question was when. I still remember that Friday morning like it was yesterday. My pa and all my brothers and me, we set out for the mine in a light mountain rain. As we all entered the mine, my pa looked back at me as he grabbed his coal tags and his lunch bucket.
"Be careful today. That rain is going to make everything slippery, and we can't afford for you to get hurt." "Yes, sir, Pa,"
I replied. And slippery it was. That entire morning, all us boys were slipping back and forth in the muck and the mud, uncoupling those cars. My buddy Tommy suddenly yelled out,
"Harrison, help me! My overalls are caught in a pinch!"
I looked up, and he was being dragged alongside a fully loaded cart that he had uncoupled. Both the cart and Tommy were barreling full speed down the track right at me. However, Tommy was holding on tight to the side of the cart to keep from getting ran over, while screaming the entire time. His weight made the cart unsteady, and it looked as if the cart was going to tip over, just enough to make the coal jump the tracks. I stood frozen for a split second. I didn't know whether to run, help Tommy, or get out of the way. In the blink of an eye, I heard the crashing sound of the cart jumping the track, tearing up the side of the wall as it raced towards me. I took one step in the mud, and I slipped and fell. There was no time to escape. I kicked my legs frantically, trying to move out of the way. By now, Tommy had freed himself and he had jumped off the coal cart and he was yelling,
"Harrison, get out of there, quick!"
In one final leap of desperation, I managed to get to my feet, but I was out of room. I had nowhere to turn, and the entire cart barreled into my chest, crushing me flat as a pancake between the wall and a ton of coal. I broke nearly every bone in my body, and folks who saw it said my eyes popped right out of their sockets. And desperately, the miners began to dig me out of the rubble as the company doctor arrived on the scene of the accident. I had lost consciousness, and I was just laying there a heap of broken bones. When they pulled my body out of the mine, the doctor shook his head and he told my pa, "Well, I'm sorry, but there ain't nary a chance that he'll make it through the night. Ain't no sense in trying to get him to a hospital in this weather. He'll never make it. Best thing to do is to take him home, call the family in, and say your goodbyes." As I laid there lifeless on that bed, I could feel my family all around me, but I couldn't make out what any one of them were saying. I just remember my mama's tear-stricken face, and then I turned my head and I realized I was looking down on my lifeless body from up above. I was caught somewhere in between this world and the next one. That instant when a soul separates from his body, I didn't feel any pain, but I felt like I wasn't done. My life hadn't even begun yet. "God, please don't let me die. I promise if you'll let me live, I'll spend all of my days telling the world about you. I promise I'll tell the entire world, far beyond those mountain ridges. Just let me live, and everyone will know your name." Now I need to pause here for just a moment. You see, there was no way Harrison Maize should have ever survived that accident. No man could have lived through it, much less a young boy. But sometimes when we least expect it, even when there's no other possible explanation, God can do the impossible. That's right, Harrison did survive, and within 3 days, he climbed off his deathbed, and he dedicated the rest of his life to telling everyone he could about God. Once Harrison returned to the coal mines, he was a changed man. In his mind, he had to get busy in a hurry, telling the world about God. Now back in those days, one of the biggest events to happen in rural Appalachia was when a tent revival came to your town. Everyone and their brother would go to these events to see and hear everything from preaching, singing, snake handling, dancing, and everything in between. Harrison figured the Lord said to make a joyful noise, so he first tried his hand at singing. The only problem was, well, he couldn't sing a lick. And though he was making a joyful noise, well, it was just noise that most folks could do without. When the next tent revival came to town, he tried his hand at preaching. But his combined fear of public speaking and the blank looks on the faces of the churchgoers told him that preaching wasn't exactly his calling either. One day, the up-and-coming preacher was sitting on the front porch, asking the Lord for a sign on what to do, when a new idea came to him. Literally, there standing right in front of him was his pet hog, Isaac, just standing there looking at him. Harrison quickly ran to the lean-to shed, and within a minute, he re-emerged with a bucket of white paint and a paintbrush. He dipped his brush into the paint and began painting, "Sin Not," down each side of the black pig. Since pigs roamed freely back then, fattening up on chestnuts, within a few days, everybody in the mining camp had read those words, "Sin Not." Harrison knew he was onto something, and he began painting his simple message on the sides of mountains, rocks, trees, barns, and even on coal cars bound for faraway places. He soon resorted to making signs out of wood, cardboard, and oilcloth, carrying messages such as "Get right with God" and "Jesus is coming." To fund his ministry, he began working double shifts in the coal mines, one for his family and one for the Lord. All the miners knew of his signs, and some would laugh while others would shake their heads in disbelief. However, they admired his effort, and every now and then they would donate a load of coal towards Harrison's ministry. Heck, even the mining company let him use an abandoned building on the property as his workshop. By 1940, Harrison's father had passed away from the dreaded black lung. As was a common practice back then, the loving son made his father's tombstone out of concrete right in the backyard as a lasting tribute. It was in that moment that Harrison had another aha moment. He began making concrete crosses and hearts weighing as much as 1,500 pounds and placing them on the side of highways for all to see. He first began by placing them in nearby states, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia, and within a decade, he had signs in nearly every state on the East Coast. He'd work in the coal mines all night and build crosses in his backyard all day. Once he had 5 or 6 ready, he would rent a truck and a driver, since Mr. Maize never learned how to drive during his lifetime, and together the two would strike out until he found a spot that looked good to him. He would simply pull up and dig a hole, and using a pulley system that he had built on the truck, he would lower the 1,500-pound cross into place. Many times, property owners would run out and yell, "What are you doing? You can't leave that here. Get off my property." Harrison would simply load up in the truck and make his getaway. Besides, as he said, asking for permission don't get you nowhere. Nearly every week, he would get a legal notice demanding that he come back and remove a cross, but he never would. He had the most trouble in Virginia. Lawmakers there were fed up with his religious signs, and they passed a law stating that all roadside signs must be licensed and taxed by the state. Once the new law was passed, the Virginia Highway Department dug up 39 of his crosses, drove them to the Tennessee side of the Cumberland Gap, and dumped them right on the side of the road. For their trouble, they sent Harrison a bill of $39.
A Mingo holler down in a mine. A broken rail car crushed him alive. He cried out to God, "Lord, if I survive, I'll spread your word the rest of my life." Get right with God, Jesus loves you. Get right with God, Jesus saves. Some found him hard and some a virtue. So goes the legend of Harrison Maize.
During the years 1920 through the 1980s, Harrison planted thousands of crosses in 44 states across America. In later years, he switched to aluminum signs because they were lighter and they would last longer. He created signs on the side of mountains near airports stating, "Prepare to meet God." He mailed an estimated 58,000 empty whiskey bottles containing scripture in 14 different languages all over the world. His bottles have been found in the Philippines, the Netherlands, and even Africa. He eventually built his own home, and even it was dedicated to the Lord. It was built in the shape of a cross, with Jesus Saves painted on the roof. It had 12 windows, just like Jesus had 12 disciples. It had 10 doors, just like there were 10 commandments. Every brick in the home was imprinted with a cross on it. It's estimated that Harrison Maize spent $100,000 of his own money funding his ministry during his lifetime. As he would say, "Every penny I ever made is God's anyway. I'm just 126 pounds of mud." When asked what religion he was, Mr. Hayes would reply, "All of them. I'm a Protestant, Catholic, Jew, Republican, Democrat. I just picked the best parts from all of them." Harrison Maize never drove during his life, and he walked or rode a bike everywhere he went. He even walked to and from his marriage to his wife Lily, who supported him his entire life and supported his ministry. Harrison was at home at any church, and he spent his entire life telling anyone he met about the Lord. Harrison Maize went on to glory and met his Maker in 1986. 3 months later, his wife Lily joined him there. However, today, if you look hard enough, you can still find many of his roadside crosses and hearts dotted throughout the South. There's even a permanent collection of his work at the Museum of Appalachia in Tennessee.
You tell him, Harrison. What a powerful testimony. Stick around, folks. Number 6 on our top 10 mountain men is coming right up. Coming in at number 6 is Kentucky's Sherman Hensley, a no-nonsense mountain man who could have survived in any time period. He was truly a man's man. This is his true story.
Sherman Hensley was the type of man I've long admired. A hard-working, simple hillsman to be sure, honest and straightforward in all affairs. He had lived most of his life on Wallens Creek in Harlan County, Kentucky, just north of the Cumberland Gap. Sherman was the type of man that could grow or hunt any food he needed, and possessed the knowledge to make any tool he might need. Now, even though it was the turn of the century, and most folks were starting to depend on store-bought goods, Sherman was still of the old pioneer spirit. He had no desire to run off and spend his life working for pig fodder in some dark coal mine like many of his contemporaries did. He watched as they toiled their life away, trying to have fancy stuff like electricity, store-bought food, and clothes. In Sherman's mind, the worst thing a man could do was to sell what little time he was blessed with on this earth, with the only reward being to be able to exist just long enough to get up and do it all over again the next day for their entire lives. In many ways, he began to view himself as a dinosaur, obsolete in this new modern world. But the truth is, he had no use for it, and he wanted to get as far removed from it as he could, for he wanted his children to know what true liberty and freedom was really like. So, in 1903, Sherman Hensley took his wife and children and disappeared from society. He loaded everything he could carry on the backs of his 2 mules, and they set out towards the sheer, nearly vertical walls of the mountains that divided Kentucky and Virginia. The mountains were so remote that few men had dared to even explore them. Most would opt for the Cumberland Gap to travel over the mountains, which was located just a few miles away. But Sherman knew this area like the back of his hand, and he knew there was a paradise waiting for him at the top of that mountain. For nearly half a day, he led his family up the steep cliffs, zigzagging up and down the mountainside, since the only route to the top was a barely visible, rarely used animal trail. It was the type of climb that was 2 steps up and 1 step down the entire way up, and it would make the strongest mountaineer double over in exhaustion many times over on their way to the top. Finally, they reached a rough break in the mountains that Sherman knew was the saddle of Chadwell Gap, and they turned and looked around. Almost straight down, they could barely see the tip of a coal tipple at the base of the mountain. To the north, the timber-sided hills seemed to spread out like even ripples, like a roll of blue-green velvet. Looking south, the rough face of the mountain rose another 500 feet over the gap. Completely exhausted, they pushed on in the thin, cool mountain air. When they finally reached the top, Sherman's wife rubbed her eyes in disbelief. "Oh my God, it's beautiful," she gasped. There before them, at the very top of this 3,000-foot near perpendicular mountain, was green grass as far as the eye could see, consisting of areas of gently rolling meadows, surrounded by virgin chestnut forest, a paradise that had only been known to the Native Americans and a few white men from the Civil War era. This would be their new home. Some areas were as flat as a tabletop. A pure mountain spring meandered through it all. It truly was stunning, like heaven on earth. The mountain commanded a full 365-degree view of the mountains and the valleys below and around it that separated Kentucky and Virginia. Sherman looked over at his young bride. "This is where we'll build our new home in our lives." That's right. In 1903, Sherman Hensley moved his family to the top of the Cumberland Mountains. There were only 2 primitive animal trails up to the top, one coming from Kentucky and the other from Virginia. The first year, the young family set out building their new home, clearing the land, planting crops, and hunting. Sherman was a master craftsman, possessing the old mountain building techniques that had been passed on to him by his ancestors, who had first come to this area through the Wilderness Road nearly 160 years earlier. All of their buildings were built from chestnut trees, which were known to be straight and true, rot-resistant, and would last for at least 100 years. They used these logs for their 2-room cabins, and white oak to cover the chinking to keep out the cold winter winds. By the first year, Sherman's homestead consisted of a cabin, a corn crib, a hen house, a barn, and an outhouse. Remarkably, the Hensley family was self-sufficient, and they only traveled by mule down to the valley a couple times that first year. Down in the valley, word spread among Sherman's family and friends. One by one, over the next couple years, a few more families packed their mules and made the long climb to the top of the mountain. where they quit their jobs at the coal mines and the factories, leaving behind them a life of paying bills and debts and embracing the pioneer oasis lifestyle that Sherman Hensley had created. Within a couple decades, there were over 100 souls living in the Hensley settlement, a community that all supported one another. They had built 2 grist mills, a blacksmith shop. The families grew, and many children were born into this pioneer world, oblivious to the modern world that existed just 3,000 feet below them. Before long, a school was built, and the families all chipped in together to pay a teacher $78 a month to come and teach their children. In fact, the teacher was the highest paid, most respected person in the community. A far cry from today's world. Each family's cabin was their domestic castle. Generally, there was one main room consisting of the kitchen and a fireplace, a couple cabinets, kitchen chairs, and a table that was used for most everything from rolling dough to ironing all the family's clothes. The bedrooms consisted of little more than a wooden bed frame with a straw-tick mattress and a dresser. All of the furniture was handmade, the old-fashioned way, with a broad axe. Material possessions were few. Each family might own a hand-cranked Victrola record player or a hand-cranked radio that the family would gather around the fireplace and listen to at night, or it might be brought out on the porch for socializing with visitors. Resting on the mantel, there might be a clock and a Bible next to a hog-killing rifle hanging above them. There was no refrigeration. All food was kept in a spring house or down at the spring. Women made all the quilts and the bedding and the clothing, for these folks didn't concern themselves with worldly possessions. They traded all of those away when they climbed to the top of this mountain. Farming was the main occupation for everyone, with the main crop being corn. It had so many uses. It could be ground up for meal, used as a vegetable, or just as important, bottled up as moonshine. They grew oats and soybeans and millet. They even grew grasses such as timothy, redtop, and orchard. They grew cane to make sorghum molasses. Vegetable gardens consisted of onions, Irish potatoes, and peppers, and turnips, and peas, and tomatoes, and cabbage, and strawberries. They planted apple, peach, and plum trees, while the forest provided a bounty of black walnuts, chestnuts, hickory nuts, blackberries, huckleberries, and wild strawberries. All of the families coordinated and shared their crops, so there would be plenty for the summers and falls, and canned up to make it through the winters. Even the animal livestock were carefully thought out. The preferred workhorse of each family was a mule. It cleared the land, tilled the soil, and made for a good friend. Best of all, it didn't require any special treatment like a horse did. Each family had a milk cow, a few chickens for meat and eggs, and hogs that would run wild on the mountain, fattening up on the chestnuts from the forest. A few families even kept sheep for wool and did some beekeeping. The surrounding forest provided a bounty of small game, wild turkey, squirrels, rabbits, coons, and occasionally a deer. Now, there weren't any doctors in the community, but the people of the Hensley settlement were keenly in touch with nature's medicine. They dug ginseng. There was plenty of catnip and pennyroyal, and on visits to the valley, they would purchase sassafras, turpentine, and balsam oil. They knew many old mountain remedies they would use as natural medicines for everything that might ail a person. Yet, because there weren't any hospitals available, many children died during childbirth or at a very young age. If an adult got sick, there was usually no way to carry him down the mountain, and it might take days for a book-learned doctor to reach the top of the mountain. And even today, the cemetery in Hensley settlement still serves as a reminder to these harsh realities. Now, it was unrealistic to try to carry any crops down the mountain to try to sell in the valley, and folks found it much easier to bring moonshine down. That's right, they made corn liquor, apple brandy, blackberry wine, and brandy. A man could take a mule, load it down with the good stuff from the settlement, down to one of the communities near the foot of the mountain in either Virginia or the Kentucky side. He could sell a gallon of it for $10. The law didn't bother the mountaintop distillers very much. Yet, one time, one of the Hensley boys got in trouble for selling this liquor down at a coal mine camp, and a Kentucky sheriff decided to climb the mountain and arrest him. Yet, once the lawman reached the top of the mountain, he was so overwhelmed by the hospitality and the good liquor that he forgot why he came. And so it was, this mountaintop utopia, Hensley Settlement, grew to over 100 people, each a part of this community, unknown and forgotten to the modern world. The Roaring '20s and the Great Depression of the 1930s came and went. They were immune to it all in their remote paradise. They all planted the seeds and harvested the bountiful crops together. They worshiped together, celebrated the birth of a baby and the passing of an old one as a community. They held dances, celebrations, and weddings together. They built homes, fences, and schools together. They broke bread with one another, and they made sure their neighbors didn't go without, something that seems so distant with the stresses of life that we all face today, as we've all witnessed the gradual erosion of these characteristics in society. Someone a lot wiser than me once said, "All good things must come to an end," and so it was too with the Hensley settlement. During the 1940s, the World War took its toll on the settlement, as every man in America was needed for the bloody World War II, even those atop that mountain. These young men who had never known life in the outside world, when they came back from the war, they met wives, they took jobs down in the valley. Slowly, one by one, families who had lived pioneer lifestyles for nearly 4 decades in Hensley settlement climbed down the mountain, never to return. Until one day, in 1948, Sherman's best friend, Willie Gibbons, who had been on the mountain with him since 1904, he shook Mr. Hensley's hand and bid him farewell and disappeared down the mountain. Sherman looked around at all the cabins, the grist mills, and the fields. They were all empty. He looked at the school where his 11 girls and 8 boys had grown up, and he was now silent. He looked at the cemetery where his wife, who had passed in 1937, rested. All that was there now was the sound of the breeze gently blowing over the meadows, the rustling of trees, and the sounds of the animals. Sherman Hensley, the man who had built this settlement, was now all alone.
Sherman Hensley moved his family in 1904 to have a peaceful place to live and raise a lot of corn. He said town made him fidget like a little boy in church. He'd find freedom on Brush Mountain before the crowds and dust got worse. No road, no houses for other folks to see. They had what they could carry on a trail between the trees. Up on Hensley settlement, they tried to be content, but it's hard to make it living all alone. Raising crops and children with their primary jobs. They rode the babies in their beds like colonels on a cob. But as the youngins grew up, they had questions about the world. Down in town there were movie shows, dance halls, and fancy girls. Kids sat on the cliffs and watched the bright lights beam. They'd go to bed and sleep all night, the future in their dreams. Up on Hensley settlement, they tried to be content, but it's hard to make it living all alone. They followed their wives and they followed the mines. They all climbed down
Sherman was by himself in 51. He'd just sit and watch the setting sun. Up on Hensley settlement, they tried to be content, but it's hard to make it living all alone.
In 1948, Sherman sold his 500 acres of the settlement to the Cumberland Gap Park. Part of the agreement was that he could continue to live there as long as he wanted, which he did, all alone until 1951, when he purchased a small farm down at the base of the mountain in Kaler, Virginia, where his closest neighbor was still over a mile away. As he told it, he was still within shouting distance of his mountaintop home. Years later, when Sherman was 91 years old, a news reporter asked him why he finally left. Mr. Hensley leaned back in his chair and he said, "Well, the outhouse was just too far away during the winter and too close during the summer." When Mr. Hensley died in 1979, he made one last trip up the mountain where he now rests beside his wife.
Oh, I'd have loved to have been on that mountain with Mr. Hensley. How about you? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to stick around. Coming up is number 5 on our countdown of Appalachia's greatest mountain men. Mountain men pride themselves on their ability to live off the land. And perhaps no one did it longer or better than this man. Coming in at number 5, this is the true story of North Carolina's Fed Messer. Born in 1791 in the mountains of North Carolina, this is the remarkable true story of a man who lived until 1907 for a staggering 115 years and lived in 3 different centuries through historic events such as the Lewis and Clark Expedition, the War of 1812, the Trail of Tears, the Mexican-American War, the Civil War, and the Spanish-American War. And during his lifetime, he saw some of the greatest inventions ever discovered: the telegraph, steamboats, the railroad, electricity, and the automobile. Yet he never embraced any of it. Instead, he lived for over 100 years in the same log cabin with little more than his trusty flint rifle, watching the entire world go by while never buttoning his shirt more than twice during his entire lifetime. Prepare yourself for the incredible true story of Uncle Fed. Fed Messer was born in 1791 on the South Fork of the Catawba River in Lincoln County, North Carolina, during a time when Western Carolina was still an unexplored wilderness inhabited by Cherokees. Fed's father was a Revolutionary War soldier, and for his services, he was awarded a land grant in a place called Dutch Cove along the Pigeon River in what is now Haywood County, North Carolina. Yet, at the time, Haywood County didn't exist, but by the time Fed was 5, his father moved the family, and just like that, they were among the first white people to ever settle these mountains, for a time living side by side among the Cherokees. As a young boy, Fed loved to roam the mountains. Barefooted and shirtless, he learned to hunt and fish, helping his father build their homestead and tend their crops. And back then, every wild animal known to mankind still called these mountains home, except for the bison, which had been killed off or driven out by the whites in order to move the natives out of the area. However, the trails that the large bison carved out through the hills and the hollers remained. And as Fed grew, he used these trails to explore all the surrounding mountains until he knew the area as well as the animals themselves. And by the time he was a teen, Fed was a master tracker and bear hunter, spending weeks at a time in the woods with his faithful hunting dogs. Using his father's rifle from the war,
he became an expert marksman, and as he would later say, every time he squeezed the trigger, you could rest assured that his target would be laying on the ground when the smoke cleared. Because when you only had one shot, you had to make it count. Now, he could track an animal for miles using nothing more than his God-given instincts. It was during one of these hunts that Fed had one of the most memorable events of his life. The teenage boy and his 2 dogs were out early in the morning. The sun hadn't even peeked over the eastern ridges yet, so the forest was still covered in shadows. And as Fed walked the edge of a thicket, his dogs jumped a rabbit, who ran into the clearing. Wasting no time, Fed leveled his rifle and pulled the trigger. Yet in that moment, his dogs began crying out and burst out of the thicket. And before the smoke even cleared, a panther, as black as the night sky, emerged from the thicket and pounced on one of the dogs, gashing the dog's stomach open with his razor-sharp claws. The second dog tried to attack the panther from the rear, but the wild beast spun around and was on the dog in an instant. It had all happened so fast, Fed didn't even have time to reload his musket, since a wild animal would surely kill his dogs before he could. So Fed ran at the panther, holding his musket by the barrel and swinging its stock like an axe. He landed a crushing blow on the panther's back, which caused the animal to momentarily retreat before the beast turned its full attention to Fed, and then he lunged at the boy's throat. And as the cat was still in the air, Fed closed his eyes, and mustering all his might, he swung the stock of his rifle like a bat at the wild animal, hitting him in the skull and killing him graveyard dead as the panther's body crashed into Fed. Both his dogs were critically injured in the battle, and Fed took the panther home and cooked it, feeding it to his dogs for the next 2 weeks until they slowly recovered. Stories like this made Fed Messer a legend in Haywood County, North Carolina. Locals would see him twice a year when he walked 11 miles down the mountain to Waynesville to trade in his animal hides for staples. They all called him Uncle Fed, and for more than 100 years, Uncle Fed hunted and traded for a living. Now, while he never once had a dollar to his name, he'd never wasted a single minute of his life chasing one either. Uncle Fed lived in solitude on the Pigeon River for nearly 115 years, oblivious to the outside world events, with all its endless wars, the Trail of Tears, and countless inventions. He only learned news of the outside world on his semi-annual trips down the mountain, where he saw a train for the first time, electric lights, and even horseless wagons that could push themselves that folks called automobiles. But Uncle Fed wanted no part of it. Instead, he embraced a simple life, living with nature. In 1901, a reporter made the 11-mile trek up the mountain and took these pictures of Fed. And for the first time, the man who lived during 3 different centuries was interviewed. When the reporter arrived, he found the old man still living in the same cabin that he had built 100 years earlier. The home was a double-roomed log cabin with walls of hewn logs that still bore the marks of the axe. The floors were loose, heavy planks with a chimney made out of rock gathered from the hillsides and streams. The doors to the cabin were hung on by hickory thongs, since hinges were unknown to the architect, and the chinks between the walls were once filled with clay and straw during its early years, but most of them were now open, allowing the wind to rush in and out as if it were tearing through a latticed barn. Heck, a half-grown boy could crawl through some of those holes. For furniture, he had an old spinning and weaving tool and just a couple of split-bottom chairs. This was a house that Uncle Fed had once raised 9 children in, along with his wife, who by now were all dearly departed.
The reporter found a 109-year-old man sitting in front of his fireplace, resting a leg that he had injured while chopping firewood a few days earlier, when a log split and hit his leg. The old man wore a beard that was several days old. His face was hardened by the years of life, but he still had a gentleness in his clear blue eyes. The reporter introduced himself and offered Uncle Fed a pint of whiskey as a gift, to which the old man quickly put it to his lips, smacking about a tablespoon down before remarking, "Well, that's plumb good. Did you bring any backer?" Just like that, the two engaged in an hours-long interview about the old man's life. And although he couldn't read or write, Uncle Fed quoted scripture from the Bible with remarkable accuracy. He talked about George Washington and the day he died when he was a kid, about all his years of hunting and being chased by black bears and bucks. And when asked why his shirt was always unbuttoned, he replied, "Well, I ain't buttoned it up but twice in my whole life. The first time was when I got married, and they made me fasten it at the top and tied a handkerchief around my neck. But as soon as I got footloose, I tore that blasted thing off. The other time is when I was hunting, and it was freezing all day. It was so cold that you could spit, and it would freeze before it hit the ground. So I buttoned it up for the second time and the last time that day." Even at 109 years old, Uncle Fed was in great shape and still walked the 22-mile round trip down and up the mountain twice a year to get supplies, even though it took him 3 days. And he was still known to dance a jig in the cabin and to even swim in the Pigeon River. When asked what his secret was to a long life, he replied, "Child, I've taken a dram of whiskey before breakfast for 90-odd years. It takes the flashes off my stomach, but I never drink it more than that, because I learned early on that it affects the way you see life. And I've chewed tobacco ever since I was a boy. And other than that, I spend as much time outside with the animals and the trees. We're all made of this earth, you know. And the closer you keep yourself to it, the better off you'll be." As the reporter prepared to leave, he asked the old man one last question. "Uncle Fed, you've never rode on a train or in a car. You've never even made a phone call or had electricity. Let me ask you something. Of all the inventions that mankind has invented during your life, which one has had the greatest impact on you?" And to that, Uncle Fed replied, "Well, the last time I was down in Waynesville, I went down to the general store to eat some supper. And afterwards, a lady gave me something that cooled my insides, all the way down, I tell you, plumb to my toes. It was the most amazing thing I'd ever felt. So I asked her, 'Hey, say, missus, what was that cold sauce that you just gave me after I finished my meal?' And then she replied, 'Why, Uncle Fed, don't you know that's called ice cream?' And I said, 'It is. Well, next time, give it to me first. Ain't no sense in waiting until later for something that good.'" Uncle Fed Messer, the legendary bear hunter and tracker, who lived for 3 centuries, died in 1907 at 115 years old, and is buried in Waynesville, North Carolina. Stick around. The top 4 greatest mountain men are coming right up. Some men never recover from a broken heart, and David Greer was one such man who took his broken heart to heights never dreamed before, and in the process became a mountain man legend. The year is 1802. Fed up with the corruption in government and rejected by society, one man decides to abandon everything he knows and retreats to the top of Big Bald Mountain, deep in the Appalachians. Here, he built his own country, complete with his own constitution and set of laws. And for the next 3 decades, he ruled his domain with an iron fist against any man who dared to threaten his sovereignty. This is the true story of the Hermit of Big Bald Mountain. Our story begins in the late 1780s. a German family with the last name Greer, lands on the coast of South Carolina to begin to make a new life in America. Seeing that all the coastal land was claimed, the family kept pushing inward and westward until they reached the foothills below the Appalachian Mountains in the northwest corner of North Carolina. It was here in Buncombe County, just off the French Broad River on Reams Creek, that the family planted their roots and began to carve out their own little piece of the American dream. The family's eldest son was named David, a husky fella who was over 6 feet tall by the time he was 18 years old. Now, David was intelligent, and he loved to read the literary classics of the time, as well as books on philosophy and law. By all accounts, this young man seemed destined to make his mark during his lifetime. Now, it was about this time that David began to feel the urge to set out on his own. So he bid farewell to his family and began roaming the settlements and villages that dotted the mountain valleys. Before long, David gained employment to a wealthy man named Colonel Vance, who was a soldier, a school teacher, surveyor, and farmer who had moved to North Carolina during the Revolutionary War. And he had even fought in the Battle of Kings Mountain. Mr. Vance had helped survey the North Carolina-Tennessee state line that ran atop the tallest peaks in the Great Smoky Mountains. And Colonel Vance took in David and made him a laborer on his farm, and had even given him a place to sleep in the hayloft of his family barn. Each night, Mr. Vance allowed David to eat supper with the family, where he would tell of his battles during the war and stories from exploring the untamed wilderness and encounters of wild beasts in the Smoky Mountains. For his part, David did his best to listen to the stories. Yet, truth be told, he was distracted by the beauty of the Colonel's teenage daughter, Mary, who was seated across the table from him. And Mary, she was an absolute beauty, full of grace, charm, and elegance. David had never laid eyes on anyone like her in his life, and he was quickly obsessed with her. He spent his days working in the fields and his nights writing poetry and love letters by the light of the moon. Weeks turned into months. He wrote her every day, and he told her how much he loved her and how he would do anything for her. And finally, after several months, David couldn't wait any longer, and he decided he would ask Mary for her hand in marriage. However, Mary sat stone-faced as she listened to David's proposal on bended knee. And when he was finished, he looked into her eyes and eagerly awaited for her response. Yet it was clear Mary didn't feel the same, and she also made it clear that she would never marry a man like David, a common laborer. "But Mary," David pleaded, "you know how I feel. I've expressed my love for you in letters, day after day for months." And just then, Mary spoke. "You're a fool. I never read a single word from those letters, and I tossed them all into the fireplace each and every night." Then, with the coldest look possible in her eyes, Mary stood to leave, but paused for a moment and looked back at David with a smirk on her face. "You don't deserve a woman like me. I'm much too high maintenance for a poor man like you." And with that, she walked out of the room and David's life.
Minutes turn to days, and colors turn to gray without you. Memories start to fade, and everything is pale without you. And I
It's well known that the power and the allure of a beautiful woman can make an otherwise sensible man lose his mind. In fact, it's happened countless times in history. And you see, David was no different. He was completely crushed by Mary's rejection, and something inside of him snapped. Her words made him feel worthless, and he was beyond redemption. That night, he looked out the window of his hayloft. The moon was full, and the air was calm and quiet. Surely, somewhere out there, among those lonesome, towering mountain ridges, he must belong. His eyes scanned over the dark masses in the distance. They were void of any government, and lawlessness was just as natural as the clear waters that flowed throughout them. And just like that, by daybreak, David Grier walked away from the rules and the norms of so-called civilization and was bound for a life of isolation in a place that no white man had ever lived before, in the wildest, most untamed region of the mighty Appalachians, at the very top of Big Bald Mountain. David Grier took all the money he had in this world, $6.25, and he bought 50 acres for 12.5 cents each on Big Bald Mountain. And folks down in the valley, well, they thought he was nuts. No one in their right mind would live up there. But David, he was a broken man. His entire personality changed. Gone was the poetic writer and literary scholar that he once was. Now he was a man mad at the world, full of scorn and hatefulness. Now the Great Bald Mountain, as with all Appalachian mountains that have the name Bald, it had no trees at the top. Instead, it was a vast, level grassland at its summit. Now, long ago, Native Americans claimed that when God was forming the Appalachians, a giant buzzard flew over the flat earth, and each time his wings touched the earth, a valley was formed, and where his wings turned up, a mountain was formed. And each time the bird's feathers grazed a mountaintop, a bald summit was formed, where no trees would ever grow. Instead, they were fertile and flat as a tabletop peaks. Here at the top of Big Bald, just inside the Tennessee state line, David found a rock cave next to the head of Higgins Creek, and he made it his home. Now, David was a well-educated man for the times, and he declared himself sole sovereign owner of Big Bald Mountain. He wrote his own articles of government, and even a series of laws and punishment prescribed for anyone who accidentally hiked up his mountain and broke one of those laws. And ignorance of his laws, well, that was no excuse, and he would render harsh penalties such as a slug from his hog rifle or a good old-fashioned fist beating to any and all violators. And farmers down in flatland country, they would turn their cattle loose and let them graze on Big Bald. So David dug a moat around the entire summit, which served to keep his personal cattle in and others out. In his mountain kingdom, the young hermit raised rye, potatoes, corn, and tobacco. Iron ore was plentiful on the mountain, so he made all his own tools. Now Grier built a small mill on Higgins Creek to grind all his corn, and each spring, the grizzled man would trek down the mountain to flatland country, where he would obtain his yearly supplies of bullets, seeds, and such. Yet, he never paid or bartered for the goods. He simply took what he wanted, and any store owner who made the mistake of asking for payment would soon find themselves on the wrong end of a savage beating for their efforts. All of the folks down in Flat Pond would lock their doors when the hermit of Big Bald Mountain, David Grier, made his yearly pilgrimage, and mothers would even threaten unruly children that they'd leave them outside for David if their behaviors didn't improve. After a few years, a taxman from the North Carolina side of the mountain wandered onto Grier's property and informed the mountain renegade that he was delinquent on a 75-cent poll tax. And upon hearing this, David informed the revenuer that he would personally take care of the obligation
on the next court date. And, true to his word, the following month, Greer appeared at the Morganton, North Carolina courtroom. And when his case was called, David approached the bar with a loaded gun and ordered the judge, sheriff, and jury outside. Then he proceeded to bust all the windows out of the courtroom and carved his initials in the judge's desk with his pocket knife. Just like that, those taxes were dismissed. So it was, David Greer lived alone at the top of Big Bald for over 30 years, hunting and farming by day, and writing theses on human religion and government by night. But by the late 1830s, more and more folks began to climb up the hillsides, looking for places to homestead. And although David didn't like it one bit, a fella named Holland Higgins bought the property adjoining David's. Now, the newcomer tried to live peacefully with his neighbor, but David, he continued enforcing his constitution and the laws he had written that governed the mountain. And after an argument over Mr. Higgins shooting a deer on Mr. Greer's property, David shot Holland Higgins dead. Now, accounts differ on whether he was ever tried for the crime. Some say he was acquitted because he was insane, and others say he was never tried because there weren't any witnesses. But either way, time was running out on Greer's law and rule over the mountain, because folks were flat out afeared of his hot and volatile temper, and began to arm themselves at all times, just in case they ran across him. And time finally ran out for the Hermit of the Mountain on one spring day in 1834. David had traveled down to the valley and took some farming tools to be repaired at the blacksmith shop of George Tompkins, and he dropped them off. Upon leaving, he told the blacksmith exactly what day and hour he would return to pick them up. Yet, when David returned, the blacksmith, he hadn't even started work on the repairs. The wild and unpredictable mountain man was furious, and he stormed out of the door and made his way back to his mule to grab his rifle. An onlooker told the blacksmith right then and there that he had just signed his own death warrant for not repairing those tools. So the two men locked the door and cowered inside for nearly 4 hours. Wanting to see if Greer was still outside, the blacksmith put his hat on the end of his rifle and stuck it where it was visible in a window. And within seconds, a ball of hot lead busted through the glass and shot the hat across the room. David, he was sure he had killed the no-good-for-nothing blacksmith, so he mounted his mule and set out to leave town. And seeing this, the blacksmith slowly poked his rifle out the window and shot David Greer in the back, killing him dead. Finally, after 32 years of making the entire world pay the price for a woman who scorned him, the Hermit of Big Bald Mountain ruled no more.
Stick around, y'all. The top 3 is just around the corner. One of the greatest characteristics of any mountain man is craftiness and the cunning ability to outwit any potential adversary. And I'll tell you right now, no one was more crafty than Squire Sitten of Hendersonville, North Carolina.
Squire Sitten peeped at the hot midday sun from the shade of his front porch. In the distance, 6 of his sons worked busily, digging deep trenches through a swampy area of his homestead that had never been farmed before. But the way Squire figured, a man's got to do what a man's got to do to make a living. After all, living on Boylston Creek had been hard on the old-timer. It all started 2 years ago, when Squire took out a small loan from his neighbor, Mr. Carr, to pay some back taxes on his farm. Now, Mr. Carr was a wealthy man who just so happened to be the owner of a small bank over in Asheville. He told Squire to take his time and pay him back whatever he could, and the 2 men shook hands, and the deal was struck without any paperwork. After all, that was a neighborly thing to do, since Squire had helped Mr. Carr out countless times in the past. Well, anyway, the following year after the loan, there was a terrible drought that swept through the entire section, and nearly everybody's crops had failed, including Mr. Carr's. Heck, most folks barely survived. However, Squire had some of the best farmland there was in the county, and most of his crops made it to harvest. Yet, the good neighbor gave most of his food away and helped nearly everybody in his area make it through the crisis. You see, Squire had been raised that way, to help anyone out when they needed it, and that when you looked a man in the eye and you shook his hand, that your word was your unbreakable bond, a promise that could never be broken. But last fall, I tell you, you never seen a man madder than the old Squire when he was served papers from the courthouse signed by a judge stating that Mr. Carr had been awarded 10 acres of the old Squire's most fertile farmland as restitution for non-payment of the small loan. That low-down scoundrel, the old Squire scowled presently as he sat on the porch. He took everything I had. I should have known better than to ever have trusted a banker. And it was for that reason that Squire had his boys digging ditches to drain the swampy patch of ground that had never been cultivated before. He had to drain it so as to be able to plant his crops next month. Now, I need to pause here for just a moment, folks. You see, all the stories I tell on this channel are true, including this one. But I'm fairly certain that what I'm about to tell you is going to blow your mind. And you're probably going to think to yourself, well, I ain't never heard that before. Well, my response to that is, well, that's good. That's what this channel is all about, bringing lost history back to life. Anyways, prepare yourself for the facts that come next. Out in the field, the boys were working their manual drag lines on the sloppy gumbo muck. They had already hit a few veins of lime, and it appeared the rich soil would easily support crops once they got it dried up. Just then, the oldest boy, Earl, struck something hard. He used his shovel to remove the mud from around the rock. When he noticed, it kind of looked like a foot. By now, the other boys had joined in, and more excavation revealed that this rock was extremely large. So they kept on digging, and when Earl finally jumped down in the pit and took his hands rubbing the mud away, it was suddenly revealed that the face of a petrified man was looking right back up at him. Not caring to see any more, Earl scrambled out of that ditch like a scalded cat in one jump. "Paul, come quick, come look at this." After examining the strange figure, the Squire decided to hook up some ropes and a pulley system to his mule, and they pulled the mysterious relic from the bowels of the earth. They loaded it on a wagon and took it back to the cabin where they cleaned it up, and what they found was astonishing. It was a man with a very detailed face, frozen in time. He was 5 foot 10 inches tall, with feet so big that they would have taken a size 15 boot. But who was he? And just how and when did he get there? Now, back in 1903, the radio hadn't made its way onto the market yet, but word still spread the old-fashioned way, by wagging tongues. And boy, I tell you, by the next day, Squire Sitten's homestead was the talk of Henderson County, North Carolina. Folks traveled from as far as 40 miles away by horse and wagon to get a glimpse of the petrified man. Several doctors and newspapers were on the scene and verified that this was indeed a petrified human. Several speculated that it was a British soldier from the American Revolution, since they found a petrified bullet nearby. Others claimed that it was their long-lost relative who had disappeared many years ago. Over 100 people were able to describe the details of just how and when the relative disappeared and just so happened to be found on Boylston Creek. Widows from all over Henderson County developed a fondness for the petrified man. Every widow in this section of the country whose husband had disappeared burst out into tears and said, "There's my Tom," or "There's my Bill," or "There's my dear John." One woman said, "I know him by his dear feet." Another woman said, "I know that's my husband because he had a scar on his leg and look at the petrified man. He has a scar on his leg." I tell you, it got so bad that after a while, Squire Sitten had to get a guard to keep watch day and night to keep the widows from coming and bodaciously eloping with the petrified man. For weeks on end, the crowds kept coming when it suddenly dawned on Squire that folks might be willing to pay a pretty penny to see this petrified man. Oh, dollar signs flashed in his eyes, and the old squire suddenly took to liking the man in stone as if he were his own flesh and blood. He even dressed the petrified man in the best clothing that the wily old man could find. And, as it turns out, he was right. Folks lined up by the hundreds, paying 1 dime each for a peek at the famous man. Soon, the crowds at Boylston Creek had died down. So the squire started taking the petrified man on tour to nearby towns before finally making his way to the big city of Asheville. Now, the day he rolled into Asheville, his prized possession was resting gently on a bed of straw in the back of his wagon, and it turned into a spectacle that no one forgot during their lifetimes. The approach of the petrified body was heralded by horsemen who had passed the farm wagon on the road. A curious crowd assembled there and considered it a privilege to pay 10 cents to gaze upon the stony countenance. The entire procession could be seen coming up Biltmore Avenue. A string of dirty-faced urchins ran behind the wagon and jeered as the squire rode majestically through the streets. Napoleon in all his glory couldn't have entered a city more triumphantly than the old farmer did. A passel of dogs were excited by the commotion, attending to the wagon's entry in the city that was preceded by 2 horses drawing the funeral coach. Their barking was augmented by the cries of children following the wagon, so loud that it caused storekeepers to desert their shops. Patrons of saloons rushed to the doorway to ascertain the cause of the confusion. Within moments, a group of 150 people stood near the wagon, and after securely fastening his horses to a hitching post in front of the courthouse, Squire Sitten stood up on the driver's seat and cleared his throat and began an oration worthy of a circus barker. "Ladies and gentlemen, step right up. 1 dime to take 1 look." Oh, his talk brought instant results. People began to file past him and fill his palm with shiny dimes. As the day grew, so did the crowd of spectators. Heck, by 1 hour he had made over $35. Across the street from the courthouse, looking out the window, was the old crooked banker man himself, who had ripped off Squire and stole his land. He said to his assistant, "Look how much money he's making. Something's got to be done." So the banker stepped outside for a closer look. Both the squire's pockets were bulging and spilling over, with both fists full of money. The cowardly banker timidly approached the owner of the freakish exhibit and offered him $500 to purchase the petrified man. But the squire, he never even looked down at him. "That's right, ladies and gentlemen. Step right up, 10 cents each." The banker raised his voice. "I'll give you $1,000. But Squire, he kept right on collecting dimes from the scores of curious folks. $3,500, old man, and that's more than your entire property's worth. I'll give you cash right now, out of the vault." "Well, that's more like it," the cunning mountain man said without any expression on his face. And just like that, Squire Sitten sold the mysterious petrified man to the greedy banker who had stole his land for $3,500. And that, my friend, was a fortune in 1903. The banker quickly got to work, establishing a legal business, and he named it the Pristine Petrified Phenomenon Company, whose sole asset was the petrified man. During the following days, dimes continued to flow into the coffers of the newly organized company. The interest in the freak, however, began to wane as days of the exhibition entered into weeks. Business was lacking, so arrangements were made to exhibit the man on the Murphy branch of the Southern Railway. A tour of several weeks in the Murphy, North Carolina section was profitable, But it was clear that the pristine petrified phenomenon company needed more fertile grounds. Suddenly, the banker had a grand idea. You see, back then, well, much like today, the capital of freak shows was New Orleans, and there was a huge exhibition about to take place there. Surely the banker would make a fortune if he took his prized possession there. No, the petrified man was taken to the Southern Railway Station in grand style. He was placed atop on one of the finest carriages available and driven through the streets like a celebrity on the way to the train. The banker man wasn't content with trusting his prized possession to the baggage car, so the stone man was taken first class in the day coach. Once he arrived to the Big Easy, he quickly left his investment safely in his hotel room and set out to scope the city, looking for the best spot to display his investment. And the city was electric with excitement. Tents were set up all through the downtown, showcasing freaks of nature in every possible imagination. Yep, the banker was floored by what he saw next. There before him was a 10-cent booth from Iowa, set up with the exact same petrified man as his. How could this be? Someone had to make a copy of this. What a fraud, he thought, and he set out briskly walking towards the police station. But in that moment, there was another booth from Canada with the exact same stone relic, and then another booth from California, and then Mexico, and literally dozens of other booths, all set up with the exact same man that he had paid $3,500 for. And worst of all of these booths were selling it as a build-it-yourself kit for $25. Furious and devastated at the same time, the banker got back on the train, bound for North Carolina. But this time on the way back, his petrified man rode in the baggage department. Once he arrived back in Asheville, he sued Squire Sitten for fraud, and a trial went on for days that turned into national news. Promises of surprise witnesses maintained interest in the hearing. Witness after witness testified that the man was made of concrete. But equally as many witnesses, including 3 prominent Asheville physicians, testified that he wasn't made out of concrete, but on the contrary, he was a normal human being. And finally, after 3 weeks, litigation in the case was dropped against Mr. Sitten. The banker, though, well, he went bankrupt, and Mr. Sitten bought all his land back at public auction for $3,200. As for the petrified man, well, for many years he remained in the basement of a local funeral home before being sold to a local doctor who kept him in his basement. And as the decades went by, the petrified man's head and his arm fell off, revealing his steel rebar framework. Old Squire Sitten had successfully pulled off one of the greatest cons and revenge stories in the history of North Carolina.
Some say that the art of the poker face was born in Appalachia, where men would never let another fella know what he was really thinking on the inside. And no one had a better poker face than North Carolina's Sam Brinkley.
The events hereafter might have never happened if Samuel Brinkley hadn't stopped to look at his face in the old mirror by the cabin window. The point is, this was the first time in 7 weeks that he had been allowed to glance at a looking glass. That's because he had been having a long, hard tussle with typhoid, and because Tennessee mountain folks know, even if those city doctors don't, that sick people who see themselves in a glass will die. Samuel was able to put his clothes on, and Mary, as attentive a nurse as she was an energetic wife, guided his steps towards the window and the pillow-padded chair by the chimney. "It's safe for you to take a look at your whiskers, Pa," she said good-humoredly. "You put me in the mind of one of those clowns that we seen that time at the circus." The fever-wasted mountaineer surveyed his image in the cracked and dingy glass. His 2 months of coal-black beard threw into startling contrast the pallor of his sunken jaws and his white forehead. He stroked the thick stubble slowly. "Mary," he piped weakly, "it 'pears for a sick man I've raised a right smart crop of whiskers. My granddad had a master beard on him. Do you recall ever seeing him? Yes, Paul, Mary replied. I remember seeing your granddaddy lots of times when I was a gal. I used to be scared to meet up with him on the road. His big black whiskers, they looked plumb scary to a youngin'. Now come on and sit a while I make up your bed. Samuel sat down on the cushioned chair, where the sunshine fell greatly upon his weak frame. It was good to gaze again upon the friendly ruggedness of the waters of No Business Creek that ran just across the holler. He would soon be out there once more among the other mountaineers who ran the puffing engines and fed the whining saws at the lumber mill. Again he rubbed his scrubby cheeks and chin. Mary, he said, let me have one more look-see in that glass. I've got a mind to just let 'em keep growing a spell. Granddad always said a good beard looked mighty fine on a fella. I reckon you can let 'em stay a while, Paul, the mountain woman replied. You're sort of whopper-jawed anyway, and a beard would set right well on you until you get all fleshed up some. I ain't willing, though, to let you grow it big and bristly like your grandsires was. The youngins will be scared of you for sure. And yes, that's why I crave to raise me a good set of whiskers, Mary. There was a plaintive eagerness in the weak voice. In this day and time, youngins need to have more fear and respect for those in authority, especially their pa, which the good book plainly says he ought to be the head of the family. There's too many women and children nowadays, a ripping and a tearing and a running, hither and yonder, a pleasuring themselves. Us men and fathers, we should be tending to our duty of raising hair on our chins and our chests, like the old patriarchs of the scriptures. This bit of social and domestic philosophy brought no audible response from the busy wife, who was briskly fixing up the bed, and Samuel failed to see the momentary smile that lit up her stoic face like the swift glow of heat lightning on a summer evening cloud. Now, Paul, get back in bed, she directed, in the quiet way of one accustomed to being obeyed. I've tidied up your straw tick, and I put a clean slip on your pillow. Now I'll make you a little mess of squirrel broth for your supper. In a few weeks, the gang at the sawmill welcomed Samuel back to his place as operator of the cutoff saw. And as his softened muscles grew back to their wonted hardness, his beard also grew. The mill hands made it the subject of much banter and even threatened to impress the services of Tony Teaker, the rough and ready camp barber. Now Samuel, he was extremely sensitive to banter, a stalwart of body he was, and a good hand on any job in the woods. But inwardly, he was a shrinking soul, albeit far from him to admitting that fact to anyone, even himself. He secretly nursed the worthy ambition to be known as a domineering, hard-boiled brute of a man. Particularly did he envision himself as lord and master of the domestic kingdom, consisting of Mary and his 8 young children of assorted ages and sizes. If he was more touchy on one point than all others, it was on the question of his status as head of the house of Samuel. Now Mary, be it said, was outwardly all that a mountain man's helpmate should be. In proper Highland fashion, she worked her man's crops, cooked his meals, spread his table, and when he had a guest, she served as waitress, silently renewing the biscuit and keeping the coffee cups full, and remaining elsewise alert but invisible in the kitchen. Nevertheless, she came from the McDavick stock, which wasn't altogether in her favor. The McDavicks were regarded by the No Business Creek folk as a woman-bedeviled lot of men persons. It was even rumored that some of the men in that unfortunate clan had to do the milking and the churning. And if the truth must be told, Samuel himself had his moments of doubt as to Mary's full and unseen acceptance of the apostolic doctrine of wifely submission. Mary had a way about her at times, to say the least. Despite the jesting of the mill hands, Samuel held fast to his resolve to let him grow a spell. He had a feeling that a full beard was going to enhance his dignity as a lord of creation. He never dreamt that he was suffering from an inferiority complex, but he did suspect that his neighbors were whispering that Mary wore the breeches in their household. And sure enough, the young and inspiring beard was already adding the marks of distinction to his otherwise unimposing face and he could see that himself. It soon became apparent, too, that the beard, or something, was working a noticeable change in the attitude of his fellow men. The gang had suddenly taken to calling him sir, and once or twice a new man had even addressed him as Mr. Samuel. It really paid to look rugged, just as his granddad had said. The months went by and lengthened into years in the slow, slinking way that old time has in the mountains. But as for Samuel Brinkley, he seemed to defy time, and somehow he got away with it. He looked scarcely a day older, and his well-knit frame remained just as straight and stout as ever. And his beard, well, it was a beard now. In fact, it had come to be accepted by the general public as part of the order of nature. For him, to be sure, it had begun to assume some aspects of a major problem. For one thing, it got in his way as he deftly caught the pine boards that came endlessly by the conveyor rolls to the cutoff saw, and it was really dangerous. It's sort of risky around a sawmill, he admitted. I heard the other day a fellow over at the North Camp got too close to a belt, and before he could say scoot, he lost a plumb beautiful beard and most of the face that it growed on. Now, Samuel's was certainly not a beard of the common garden variety. It once was blacker than midnight in a coal mine and glossier than a crow's wing. But now, it was a beautiful silver, like the prophets of old. It fell like a curtain well below his knees. That is, when he allowed it to fall, as he sometimes did for the edification of admiring friends. Most of the time, though, he carried it folded carefully in a black satin pouch that he wore on the inside of his vest underneath his coat, and soon he was a local legend as he passed through the No Business Creek community carrying his trailing beard in his specially made pocket. One Saturday, a score of mill hands off duty were loafing in the company store watching the valiant but futile efforts of a patient medicine salesman who tried to land a fat order from Dan Bickett, the canny manager of the camp store.
"No, there ain't nothing I'm needing today,"
drawled the soft-spoken manager.
"These fellas around here, they're a right healthy lot. And when they're ailing, they mostly stick to salts, balsam oil, and sassafras." "Now just a moment, Mr. Bickett."
The fluent salesman came back undaunted.
"I was about to overlook one thing, one of the most necessary preparations for any well-stocked store. And as you know, there's a great deal of baldness among timbermen. Now, I have one of the best remedies for baldness ever offered to the public. Dr. Flimber's Peerless Hair Restorer and Scalp Invigorator. Endorsed by clergymen and recommended by the press everywhere. Just $1 a bottle. Let me send you a trial order, Mr. Bickett." "Say, mister,"
a burly teamster sang out,
"is that stuff guaranteed to raise whiskers too?" "Why, the surest thing you know,"
came the quick response.
"It'll grow burnsides on a billiard ball and chin whiskers on a doorknob. Try a bottle, my good man. Only $1. "No, I ain't hunting no more troubles than what I've got,"
the man retorted.
"It already takes a brand new razor to get me fixed up Sunday morning now. But there's another fella here who's trying awful hard to get some chin tassels sprouted. I reckon you could sell him a whole case of it if it's got a guarantee to it."
Soon, a chorus of other onlookers chimed in agreement of this opinion. Someone hurried out to find Samuel and returned presently with the shaggy sawmill man in tow.
"Samuel,"
Dan Bickett drawled,
"we've been telling this man here about you trying to start up a beard, and he claims he's got the growingest stuff there is to rub on your feeble efforts to grow a beard and speed 'em up a little bit."
The salesman took one look at the mountaineer and joined heartily in the laugh that went around. He thought he saw the joke. Really, though, he hadn't seen half of it. To be more accurate, he had only seen 12 inches or so of Samuel's beard that terminated at the top of the invisible black pouch. He didn't even suspect that a half yard or so laid cold within.
"Well, my friend," he remarked, "I'll hand it to you. You've made a fine beginning in beard production. But if you start using Dr. Flimberg's Peerless Hair Restorer and Scalp Invigorator at once, in less than 6 months, you'd have a beard that would reach your knees. See here,
I'm going to make you as a fair a proposition as you had ever heard. You take 3 bottles of this tonic and use it according to the directions, and I'll be back this way next spring. And if you're entirely satisfied, you pay me $3. And if you're not, you pay me nothing. And that's not all. If you do use this treatment faithfully, and you don't have your beard cut before I get back, I'll have your picture made for our advertising department, and we'll pay you a certain amount for every inch of beard that you grow as a result of our remarkable product. Well, how much will you pay? The shrewd hillsman queried. Well, let's suppose we make it $1 for every full inch of new growth by that time. How does that strike you? And Samuel almost gasped, but his face betrayed no hint of his astonishment. I reckon that'd be reasonable enough, he casually replied. And how long do you judge it is now, mister? Oh, I have nothing to measure it with, but I'd say it looks from this distance to be about 12 inches. The mill hands would have torn the house down with their shouts had Dan Bickett not forestalled their outburst with a warning wink. Samuel's face was as solemn as a veteran politician. Well, mister, it might be a smidgen longer than that, he said soberly. That's all right, my friend. I see you want to be strictly honest, but what's a little matter of an inch or so between friends? We'll have these men here as witnesses that when I come back, I'll pay you $1 for every inch of beard that you've grown above 12 inches. That's satisfactory, isn't it? Well, I'm satisfied if you are, mister, Samuel replied, and the salesman hurried away to catch the train. The busy weeks passed quickly. Samuel used the hair restorer and the scalp invigorator faithfully according to the directions. For a whole week, he was fired with determination. He was going to be the proud owner of the longest, thickest beard ever boasted in all the glorious history of Appalachia. Had he not been promised, in the presence of good men and truth, that he should have his picture published? Fame stood knocking at his door. The restorer and the invigorator, however, proved to be a foul-smelling stuff and messy to apply. On the 6th day, he took the remaining 2 7/8 bottles and threw them in a gully behind his cabin. As for the beard, though, it continued to grow. It needed no restorer and no invigorator. It flourished like grass after a summer rain. Before the summer had come again, Samuel had attained the goal of his towering ambition. His beard, when he chose to let it fall at full length, to the delight of gawking onlookers, it trailed a good 6 inches on the floor. And Samuel was a big man, 6 feet 2 inches tall, standing in his socks, and it was a wondrous sight to see. The eventful day came when the medicine salesman arrived again in the camp and made his way to Dan Bickett's camp store. No, there ain't nothing I'm needing today, Dan muttered. I reckon, though, you'll be having a settlement with Samuel Brinkley today, won't you? You remember the fella that you gave that hair medicine to, and you was going to pay him for his whiskers if he was able to raise any. Oh, yes, I do recall him, the salesman replied. Sure, I'll be glad to see how he's come out with it. I wonder where he is. Well, he'll be here in a jiffy, Bickett answered. A crowd of roughnecks filed in, with Samuel marching at the head of the pack, and trying to appear as calm and casual as if this wasn't the great day for which he had waited for many months. The salesman came forward, extending a welcoming hand. Well, Mr. Brinkley, I'm glad to see you again. I guess you've come to close our little deal about that fine beard, huh? Yeah, I reckon I'm about as nigh ready as I'm likely to get, he replied in an offhand manner. Well, let's see, began the salesman. I believe we were to start with the 12 inches you had last year and measure the growth since then, weren't we? That was the sense of it, I believe, mister. Well, Mr. Brinkley, I hope you used the restorer faithfully, and you have several inches of healthy, vigorous growth to show for your efforts. Well, sir, I did the best I could with it, and I reckon nobody could have done a better job than that. No, indeed, my friend. Now step over here by this window, and we'll take this yardstick and measure the exact length of your beard today. Samuel moved to the window. The spectators gathered around in a silent circle. Samuel opened his coat and fumbled a moment with the straps that held his pouch in place. Then, something soft, silver and black, and shiny rippled to the floor. The lanky mountaineer rose to his full 6 feet 2, his head up high like an ancient pirate. Nevertheless, a foot or more of the beard fell down to the rough floorboards. The crowd could hold it no longer. With ear-splitting roars and shrieks, they fairly lifted the ceiling off the old storeroom. They laughed until they had to sit down on whatever came handy. Counters, nail kegs, and some on the floor itself. The official representative of Dr. Flemberg's Peerless Restorer rose to the occasion and proved himself a game sport. He knew the joke was on him, but he wanted the crowd to get their money's worth. He was going to get his, and it wasn't going to cost him anything. And his chemical company, well, they were going to get some real advertising. For half a minute, he stood in speechless amazement, as he knew he was expected to do. And then, once the uproar subsided, he grasped the hand of the big woodsman. "Oh man, you win. You've got the prize beard of Tennessee. You've given the finest demonstration of what Flemberg's Restorer will do when used regularly and persistently. I'm going to pay you $50 in cold hard cash right now without even putting a yardstick to your beard. Let's shake on it." Samuel extended a rough hand while the body of men exploded with a new outburst of sheer joy. "Now hold on, I'm not done yet," the plucky salesman shouted, waving his arms to quiet the racket. "My good friend, why waste your time as a common laborer on this sawmill job? With you as living proof to the marvelous efficiency of this great hair tonic, I can sell a carload of it in every town from Bristol to Chattanooga. I'm going to make you a proposition. You go with me this very afternoon to Johnson City, and we'll start out on a partnership basis. You'll make more money than you ever saw in your life. We'll ride in Pullmans, pull up at the swell hotels, and together we'll sit atop the entire world." Just like that, Samuel Brinkley was destined to become world famous, far beyond the walled-in world of mountains in Appalachia. Photos of his miraculous beard appeared in newspapers and magazines all over the world. Old Sam, a mountain man who had never been more than 10 miles beyond No Business Creek, went on to travel 44 states in America and Canada and Mexico. He was featured in many traveling circuses as the man with the longest beard in the world, with the Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey Circus, and John Robinson's and Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And now, you know the amazing story of Samuel Brinkley.
Well, here we are. We finally made it to number 1 on our countdown to the greatest mountain man who ever called Appalachia home. Chess McCartney lived more adventure during his lifetime than most men could ever dream of. At 14, he ran off with the circus, where he became the lover of a beautiful Spanish knife thrower. And he traveled to nearly every state in America on foot, and even made a run for the President of the United States. Coming in at number 1, the incredible true story of the Goatman.
Appalachia has long been home to some of the most colorful characters to ever roam its winding hollers, each with stories as rugged and wild as the land itself. But perhaps none are as legendary as Chess McCartney, the boy who left home at age 14 to marry a beautiful 28-year-old Spanish knife thrower, traveling America with her as her target in her performances, before breaking her heart and blazing a trail of his own, traveling like a nomad to 49 states, led by his faithful herd of nearly 30 goats for over 40 years. He gained international fame as his legend grew and even ran to be President of the United States. This is the incredible true story of the Goatman. For some, the mountains have always been our home. We were born and raised here. But for others, the allure of the mountains have always called them from far away, and they eventually make their way here. Our story today deals with one such fella. Charles Chess McCartney was born on July 6, 1901, in Sigourney, Iowa. By all means, Chess was your typical farm boy, living a simple life. The sparsely populated town he grew up in meant that there were more animals than people, and Chess spent his days tending to them on the family farm. However, his favorite animals were the large herd of goats that his father raised. And if you've ever been around goats, you know that each one of them has a unique personality. They can be jokesters, friendly, or even just flat out mean. Even as a young boy, Chess had a way of understanding them all. In 1915, a traveling circus came to town, complete with animals, freak shows, trick riders, and an assortment of curiosities. And during one part of the show, a beautiful 28-year-old Spanish knife thrower asked for a volunteer from the audience to put a balloon on the top of their head so she could throw razor-sharp daggers at it. Taken by her sheer beauty, Chess immediately threw his hand in the air, and within a few moments, he was tied to the board with a balloon on his head.
Don't worry, my love. I would never harm a single hair on your head,
the Spanish beauty whispered into his ear before spinning the board that Chess was tied to. Within moments, she flung 2 knives at lightning speed through the air as the crowd held their collective breath. Chess's eyes widened as he caught a glimpse of the knives tumbling towards his head before hearing a large pop and the eruption of the cheers from the audience. That's how it happened. At age 14 years old, Chess left his family farm and ran away with the circus, becoming a target for the Spanish beauty each time she performed, and also becoming her lover. After a whirlwind romance, the two were married. Each night, the couple would visit some tavern or bar where Chess would take down the dartboard, and his wife would throw 25 razor-sharp knives at his head. After 4 years of touring America, the Spanish vixen retired so that she could raise a family. Yet Chess was just 18 years old. No, he wasn't ready to settle down. So, one night, as his beautiful wife slept, he grabbed his clothes and left her forever. Chess McCartney returned home to Iowa, where he worked in logging camps through the roaring 20s and the 1930s. He eventually remarried twice more and even had a son. But it was during the Great Depression that a tragic accident took place. Chess was cutting timber deep in the forest for the Works Progress Administration when he cut a tree that fell in an unexpected way, landing on top of him and shattering his entire left side and pinning him to the ground for hours. When the search party finally arrived, they presumed he was dead and took him to the local funeral home. And as he was lying there on that cold metal table, the mortician stuck the embalming needle in Chess's neck. And just then, he suddenly sprang back to life. From that moment on, Chess was a changed man. He dedicated the rest of his life to telling anyone he met how God had saved his life. So, in 1939, Chess set out to build a makeshift wagon. It was a homemade affair, covered with tin, old rubber, and tattered dingy cloth, with ropes and broken harnesses tying it all precariously together. 2 or 3 kerosene lamps were tied around the sides, with odd-sized reflectors, used for what purposes it wasn't exactly clear, tied together in clusters around the sides, and a huge dusty red flag attached to it all. A peek inside disclosed a folding camp chair, another wooden chest, a few utensils, and some bedding. As for horsepower, well, Chess had tied up 12 goats to the front and 2 spare goats trailing up the rear of the wagon. His wife took one look at the thing and said,
Ain't no way I'm going anywhere in that contraption. It's either me or them goats.
And just like that, Chess was divorced. He had had his fill of women before hitting the road. He had been married 3 times, and he was even quoted as saying, Well, the good book says there'll be 7 women for every man. Well, I've already had 3, and some other man can have my other 4. Thus, free from all the interference of women, Chess and his son set out on the road, both dressed in goat skins. Indeed, Chess was a sight to behold. His long, flowing beard and rugged appearance made him look like a prophet straight out of the Old Testament. They averaged traveling about 3 to 7 miles a day across America, traveling U.S. highways long before the interstates and backing up traffic for miles. Folks said that the Goatman's smell would roll into town long before he ever did. But Chess always said, "Oh, those goats don't care how I look or smell. They trust me, and they have faith in me, and that's a lot more than I can say about a lot of people." Wherever he went, he drew attention. As his caravan approached town, news would quickly spread. "The Goatman is coming." Folks would line the streets to get a glimpse of him. And some towns would even cancel school classes, so children wouldn't miss the big event. Those kids would chase after the goat-drawn wagon, and Chess would give each one of them a stick of gum. Once the Goatman arrived in town, he would find an empty field on the outskirts to let his goats graze. Then he would start a large bonfire of tires that he had collected off the side of the road, and of course, the black smoke would attract a large crowd. Before long, people would start pouring in, and adults would pause their daily routines to see this strange curiosity. News journalists were always on the scene to capture his story, and once he had a good crowd, the Goatman would spring into action, mounting his wagon and launching into a passionate speech about the coming of the Lord, urging everyone to repent of their sins and trust in the Lord with all their heart. When asked how he made a living, he would always respond, "Well, I'm glad you asked." And he would immediately pull out a stack of postcards from his overalls that featured pictures of him and his goats, and he would begin selling them for $1 each. Heck, for 50 cents, you could even get your picture made with him. Between the postcards, the pictures, and selling scrap metal that he found along the highway, or even donations, the Goatman managed to purchase enough food to get by on. And, of course, he always had a steady diet of goat milk. The day after the Goatman would roll out of your town, there would always be signs that he had been there. Literally. Since he would post a farewell message on his way out, saying, "Prepare to meet thy God." During the 1940s, as America faced rations on everything from food to gasoline, the Goatman crisscrossed America. And during the 1950s, he visited Alaska, Canada, and went up and down the eastern United States. Each winter, he would spend it in Georgia or Florida, where it was warmer before setting out once again in the spring. Long before Forrest Gump ever went for his long run, the Goatman roamed the highways and the byways of America. Fueled by little more than wanderlust, his fame and legend continued to grow, and as might be expected, there were a number of erroneous tales circulating about him. During World War II, rumors started that Chess was a Nazi spy who had a shortwave radio hidden in his wagon, and as silly as it sounds, a sheriff in Virginia searched that wagon looking for the mystery radio. Others said that the Goatman was actually a very wealthy man with hordes of money hidden in his wagon. Nonetheless, by 1960, the Goatman was fed up with the direction America was heading. So he threw his hat into the ring to be nominated for the President of the United States, even taking his goat parade to Chicago to the Democratic National Convention. He promised that if he was elected, he would quickly reduce government spending. The first thing he said he would do was fire all the White House gardeners and replace them with his goats. And he would place the 10 Commandments on the wall in the Oval Office. Remarkably, the Goatman traveled all across America, from 1939 to 1987, nearly a half century. It's said that he traveled over 100,000 miles to every state except Hawaii, because, as he said, his goats couldn't swim that far and they would have ate the skirts right off of those hula girls. However, most of his travels centered around Appalachia. Even today, there are scores of people from small towns in East Tennessee, Kentucky, North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Virginia who remember when the Goatman came to their town, preaching about the coming of the Lord. The roads he traveled were not just pathways through towns, but through the lives of those who met him. In each small town, the Goatman became a fixture in the local consciousness. His presence was heralded by the unique aroma of his goats and the distinctive clatter of his wagon wheels on the asphalt. For many, a glimpse of the Goatman was a cherished memory, a story to be told and retold. Sadly, not everyone loved the Goatman, and throughout his travels, Jess McCartney encountered numerous adventures and misadventures, from getting caught in a snowstorm on Peabody Mountain to narrowly escaping a deadly brewery truck accident that killed 8 of his goats and sent him to the hospital, the time he was mugged in Los Angeles trying to visit actress Morgan Fairchild. And then there was the incident in Alabama where 3 men turned over his wagon while he slept, killing 2 of his goats. And that time in Oklahoma when his wagon was set on fire with Jess sleeping in it, barely escaping death with half his beard burned off. But the one that finally made the Goatman retire happened in Chattanooga, Tennessee, when a group of men cut the throats of 2 of his goats and robbed Jess of the only $3 he had in this world. Jess finally came off the road for good in 1987. He sold all his goats to Disney World, and then he settled in Twiggs County, Georgia, where he purchased a few acres of land. At first, he lived in a small house that he had built that was just as eclectic as the wagon that he roamed America with. But alas, it too was burned by someone. After that, he lived in a school bus, and he even preached at a nearby church called the Free Thinking Christian Mission. By 1990, age had finally caught up with old Jess, and he spent his final years as a local celebrity at a nursing home in Macon, Georgia, where suddenly hippies began coming from all over the world for him to be a minister to marry them. News reporters from all over America came to the nursing home to interview him, including CBS National News and even Good Housekeeping magazine. Even in the sunset of his life, Ches McCartney never stopped telling his stories, from marrying a Spanish knife-throwing beauty at age 14 to traveling America for a half century. The Goatman, Ches McCartney, passed away at the age of 97, leaving behind a legacy that continues to captivate the imagination. The Goatman's journey may have ended, but his legend lives on, a reminder of a time when the open road called to those who had the courage to follow it. What about you, my friend? Did you ever see the Goatman? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more true stories on Appalachia's past.